Welcome back. Euclidean sequencers they've been around for a while. And so it's unusual to think that there could be something new in the space of Euclidean sequencing. But every so often somebody comes up with a new idea. And this is one of those new ideas that I was really intrigued to play with when they finally sent it to me. It's the LX Euclid from the AtoVproject. Now, you may know the AtoVproject as the people who brought us the 16N faderbank, a really well-known, well-respected, and very, very well put together piece of equipment for controlling MIDI synths or modular synths. Well, they've been busy making modules, and this new one is their own take on a Euclidean sequencer. It also has touch-sensitive rings around it, and a unique circular screen that really helps visualize the Euclidean patterns as they play, in color too. In this video, I'm going to talk through how it works. We're going to look at the features, including the touch controls you have here, and then we're going to come up with a couple of patching ideas for how you can use Euclidean sequencers to really open up your patches in terms of modulation, music, rhythm, and all sorts of wonderful things you can do with them. So let's get started. As always, let's start with a quick overview of the module and how it works in the user interface, and we'll build up a basic patch to illustrate how it works. You've got two concentric rings, which can be mapped to all sorts of different parameters. Right now, they're mapped to mute mode. I have them set up to this, but we'll go through all of that in a second. Don't worry about what's actually happening yet. They're touch sensitive. I did find sometimes my fingertips are a little dry. You might need to just have them a little more sweaty, to be honest. And the other thing I noticed was if I touched the ring and kind of touched the edge of my case here, the metal edge, sometimes the values jumped around. So if you're seeing some discrepancies in movement here, you can certainly adjust the sensitivity by pressing config and going into here. You can have low, medium, or high sensitivities, but also don't try and touch anything else because it is sensitive to it. And when you turn on the module, don't touch the rings because it calibrates those sensors there. So if you're touching them, the calibration's off. We have 4 outputs, 1, 2, 3, 4, corresponding to each of the 4 sequencers, which can be routed to anything. They are trigger outputs or gate outputs. You can adjust the gate length. We have a main clock input. There's also an internal clock, which you can sequence by tap tempoing. Right now, the firmware doesn't let you stop the internal clock. I've asked them to fix that. I think it should be able to stop. You can mute the sequencers, but you aren't able to stop the clock. And we've got 4 sequencers, each of which can be configured in different modes by pressing these 4 buttons to access them. They've done a really nice job on the user interface. So if you're in a certain configuration page, for example, you're changing the algorithm for a sequencer. You see, I just touch there. Say I change it to this algorithm. We'll get into this in a second. You can just jump between the 4 sequencers and you stay on that page. Nice little idea. I like it. Very, very usable user interface. Tap, tap, and we go back to the main screen. Got some configurations options here. The presets are nice. You can load up to 8 presets and save them. So that's really nice to see, of course. We are going to get into macro controls in a little bit later in the video. This is a really great feature that enhances the playability. You can map the 2 rings to any number of different parameters across all of the sequencers or some of them and just play away and control things. Typically, you might want to control the number of pulses or whatever, but you can also map this to mute or do fills or whatever you want. So really, really playable. And of course, we can have internal or external clock. So I'm going to do external clock for the purposes of this. And I'll use this clock here coming from PAMS into the clock input. So I have my clock set to external. Let's hit play here. And okay, we've got triggers firing away. Right, let's patch up a very basic. We'll start with the most obvious thing, which is drums. I mean, this is kind of where everybody starts when they start with Euclidean sequencing. So let's have a look at some drum sequencing. So let's now reconfigure our sequencers and let's reconfigure them to actually have different Euclidean distributions of beats. All right. So the first thing we notice is when I press the sequencer, the main screen, I'm on sequencer 1, is the outer ring is represented here on the screen. It's saying 8 and 4. That means I have 4 triggers within 8 pulses. So if I change that, I just need to change it by rotating on my finger. You see how I move my finger on the outer row here, and now it's 8 of 16, but I want to go for 4 of 16, right? So we do the inner ring to change the number of triggers. The outer ring is configured to change the number of total pulses that are available. Let's just unpatch these. Okay, we have a 4 on the floor. So if I change the length, we now have a very different rhythm. You see, I could bring it all the way down to say, if I bring it down, it's scaling them both, right? So now it's 9 of 2, but if I scale up back to 16 again, sometimes it's a bit tricky. There we go. We go up to 4, 16 with 4 pulses, 4 on the floor. So I like the way it keeps everything proportional. If you reduce the number of total pulses in the sequencer, it also correspondingly reduces the number of pulses or triggers that are in that. We can, of course, increase the number of, there we go, 6 pulses out of 16 for a nice kind of offbeat. Okay, let's add in, what do we got here? Sounds like a snare and I'm triggering with my finger. Let's go look at sequencer 2. Now we can go up to 32 steps in the sequencer, so let's do that. We go all the way up to the max. Now I have 4 pulses there in sequencer 2. Now let me illustrate something really, really powerful on the LX Euclid, which is the ability to do macro controls using these rings on the outside. Now we can do all of this with CV as well. I'll get to that a little bit later, but this is really where the playability of this module comes in. You've got these touch-sensitive rings. They're really easy to control the module with. Now by default, you can configure them to do any number of things. But say, for example, I configure them so that the outer ring adjusts the length of the sequence up to 32 steps, and the inner ring adjusts the number of triggers. You can have these rings do that for all of the sequencers. Let's start with that as an example, and then I'll show you how to selectively change sequencers using the rings. So now, right now, we've got all the sequencers running in parallel off the external clock. I can increase the length, add more triggers, and you see it's more like a fill effect all the way around. Bring it back around and it thins it out. Shorten down the sequences. So, very playable. Now I've really increased the number of triggers, and back around I go. Okay, that's a lot of fun, but it can kind of get a bit mad. And I might not want it to apply to all of the sequencers. So let me show you how to configure what these rings do and how they are mapped, because this will allow you to really use this as a playable module. So let's go to press config, and we're going to choose the macro control here. Now macro, like its name suggests, allows you to map these rings to multiple sequencers to different parameters. Let's take a look at how this works. First of all, we choose the inner ring or the outer ring, and I'm going to choose outer ring. And for outer ring, I just tap here. I have a choice of destinations. Now, some of these destinations you can choose per sequencer, and the mute and fill options behave a little differently. So we'll start with those two first so I can explain it. So I'm going to choose mute. So I just tap there, and now mute is selected on the menu. Very straightforward. Now when I go back, I'm able to mute the sequencers by tapping the ring. And the way it works is for mute and fill, you don't rotate your finger around. You tap here, 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 or here. The 4 points of the compass will correspond to muting sequencer 1, 2, 3, or 4. There's sequencer 1 muted on the inner ring I'm tapping. Sequencer 2 muted. You see it goes dark on the screen. Sequencer 3, sequencer 4. Now we hit the clock. I can unmute sequencer 1. I can unmute sequencer 4. Now I'd say, okay, let's go in and change sequencer 4 so it doesn't have so many triggers. Now I can go and unmute sequencer 2. There we go, I can edit sequencer 2 while it's playing. And I can unmute sequencer 3. Lovely. Okay, so far so good. Now let's look at how fills work. And so fills work on the same principle. Say I wanted to add a fill, not for my kick drum, but only for the sequencers, say, on this side. So again, we can go in here, press config, press macro, and now we'll choose outer ring, because now we're going to edit the outer ring, and we'll change it to fill mode. See, I tapped fill, and now I've selected fill here. Go back to the main screen. Now let's look again. The 4 points of the compass control how that is applied. So we do fill. There's the fill. I'm tapping the outer ring. Let me mute sequencers 2 and 3 using the inner ring. And we do fill. We could fill the kicks. And I turn fill off. I can mute the kicks by tapping the inner ring. Let's bring in a few additional sequencers. I'm going to mute the claps. I'm going to unmute the kicks. And now I'm going to fill. I have fill. I have fill on. You see? Very playable. Now, don't forget, I'm just showing you some examples. You can map these to anything. Okay, let's look at some other things we could map these macro controls to. So we go here, we tap macro. Now I'm going to map the outer ring, not necessarily to the fills. What I want to do is say rotate. Okay, so I'm going to tap rotate. Now when I do, the screen changes to show channel 1, 2, 3, and 4. What does this mean? It means I can map the outer ring to rotate all of the sequencers, or say I only wanted to rotate the kick, right? We'll just turn off all the other sequencers. Now my finger movement on the outer ring will change the rotation of that sequencer. Let's go back and take a look. I don't have anything on. I will mute sequencers 4, 3, and 2. So we're just looking at sequencer 1, which is the kick. Now watch what happens as I move. I'm rotating the sequencer. I could change that mapping to say the outer ring again. Maybe I want to change the number of pulses being played. Again, just on channel 1. I'm just selecting channel 1. Now, the position of the triggers isn't rotated. I can add and subtract triggers in the sequencer. The length stays the same, and I can still mute it if I felt like it. And then say, let's change these guys here. Now remember, the outer ring is still mapped to the number of pulses now. We've turned off the previous mapping. So if you like kind of playing and just jamming around on your beats, this way is a really good way to do it. You can do it also with CV. We'll get to that in a second. So we can save and load presets. When you first go into preset, you're in load mode and you can choose one of 8. Let's save this preset by pressing config. We now go into save mode. Little hard to see it, but you see there in the middle, it says save. I'm just going to tap 1. And now we've saved all of this wonderfulness to preset number 1. Now let me show you how we can do per sequencer configuration. And up till now, we've been looking at macro kind of controls where we're able to assign these rings to all of the sequencers or some subset of them. But you're also able to do things on a per sequencer basis. So again, we'll just use the kick drum as a simple example. If you press 1 here, we're now setting up sequencer 1. Now we've already looked at the inner and outer rings to change the length of the sequence and number of trigger steps. But if I press the config button, this opens up a submenu, which allows you to do CV mapping, choose the Euclidean algorithm, set the clock division, and adjust your gate time. So let's start with the obvious one and map the CV input, which can go from -5 to +5 volts, to pulses. So I choose pulses for sequencer 1, and now I want that to be CV1 input. So now when I choose the source of the modulation, it's the CV1 input here. Let's patch in a voltage here. So if it's negative, it'll subtract from the current setting, and if it's positive, it'll add to it. So if we go back up here to our sequencer, and now I have this 0 to 5 volts, so effectively it turns into a fill. Let's take a listen. But if I have this as a bipolar voltage, now -5 subtracts, and I can add pulses to it. We can go ahead and unmute the other sequencer. Let's say we wanted to map that CV input also to sequencer number 2. So let's go and press config. Again, we press CV. This time, let's map that CV input to the rotation amount on sequencer 2. And so we'll use CV1. It's going to be mapped to rotation on sequencer 2, but fills on sequencer 1. So I see we're rotating sequencer 2, but adding trigger pulses on sequencer 1. You can get carried away with this, so I would recommend a little modulation. Goes a long way with this. Don't overdo it on the modulation. If you wanted to use the modulation, for example, to mute something, so let's unmute the snare, or sorry, the clap. Let's look at how we would go about using modulation for mute. And for that, what we'll do is we'll go into the sequencer 4 here, we'll hit config, tap CV for the mapping, and we're going to choose mute. And I'll use CV4 as my mute CV input. Now what happens is once the voltage goes positive on the CV4, the mute kicks in. And so for that, I'll just take an LFO that I have running over here. You can see my LFO is running a little bit fast over here on Neo Trinity. And so the mute is going on, off, on, off. It's a little bit silly, but it's illustrating the point. As it goes positive, it mutes. I can slow down the LFO. So you get the idea. That's probably not a very good application. Let's use that, say, to potentially change the number of triggers going into sequencer 4, which of course is the clap. So we will tap config, we will tap CV, and I'll clear the CV mapping, and we'll change the number of pulses, and we'll use CV4 for that. Let's go back now. Now look at that. As the sequencer goes, as the CV input goes negative, we lose all the triggers. I could clock sync my LFO over here. Now let's look at some more advanced patching tricks. And what I'm going to do first is show how we can also use LX Euclid, for example, to sequence oscillators. We don't just have to use it as a drum sequencer. So to keep things simple, I'm just going to move the kick off the output of sequencer 1 here. So now we have a nice consistent rhythm just to base everything off. What I'm going to do is use sequencer 1 to sequence a melody out of Bastel Pizza over here. So let's get this all set up. We'll just take the main oscillator output here from Pizza. We're going to patch it into Akari as a filter, and you'll see why in a second, because I'm going to also show you how we can do some rhythmic modulation. We'll patch the output of Akari into the Bastel Basel time delay processor, and we will patch the output of that into a stereo input channel here on the mini mix. Now for simplicity, I have Pizza set up as a triggered VCA on this sync input here, which means when you send in a pulse, there's a built-in envelope in VCA which will trigger it. So it just keeps it very simple. So let's just do this for now first, and let's see what happens if we send it in a trigger off sequencer 1. Might just mute sequencer 3 there. Bring up the level. Here now we have the triggers here coming out of sequencer 1 in our LX Euclid are now triggering Pizza. Now we've got a nice little groove going on. Easy to get into crazy territory, of course, with an FM synth. Now, how about we do a little bit of modulation here? We don't just need to use this to trigger things like drums. So the first thing we'll modulate, say, is the length of that decay envelope there. And let's use mimetic digitalis for that. Now what I've done is I've just programmed in a sequence over here on Magic Digitalis. I've got this going into the X input. So we'll just iterate through 4 different values which can go into the control input here, which create a bit of a movement groove on the length of the actual envelope that's being used in the VCA in Pizza. Let's now modulate something else. We'll use Neo Trinity on envelope mode using sequencer 3. And I've got envelope output E here set to envelope mode. I'm just going to go in and set it there to envelope trigger. And we'll just set it to a decayed output. And if we unmute sequencer 3, we're getting envelopes here out of E. Let's patch them in. Well, we'll try patching it to a few places. The FM index is often a good one. Now, ooh, that's nice. We could mute sequencer 1. We won't get any triggers. Let's go ahead and configure sequencer 3, because what I want to do is map one of the CV inputs here. We're going to map that to be the number of pulses on the sequencer, and we'll use CV input 2 for that. Remember, sequencer 3 is modulating the FM index on Pizza. Now we've got something interesting. So I can play around with these. And we can still use sequencer 4 output on LX Euclid to trigger our hi-hat. Now let's take sequencer 4, patch it into envelope F over here, because the Neo Trinity has 2 envelopes you can trigger. And I'm going to patch that envelope from sequencer 4. We'll patch it into the filter modulation over here. So if I mute that, we don't get any modulation going on. We can bring it in. So now all of a sudden, we've gone from just triggering drums and having a drum sequencer to a really cool rhythmic melody modulation sequencer. Now, one of the things that can happen is when you get a little bit crazy and wild on this, your patterns can kind of really slide out of sync with your main beat. So there is a reset input here. And what we can do with that is say, take a sequence output here every 16 steps and just send a trigger in. And what that will do is just reset everything back to the start position. And that means the sequencer will reset itself and all of your sequences will kind of line up a little bit more melodically. So things aren't quite so crazy. Now, there's different types of Euclidean sequencing built into LX Euclid. And I don't know if you could strictly call it Euclidean sequencing, these other modes it has. Let me just explain what I mean by this. If I go into a sequencer 1, say, we just strip down the patch so it's nice and simple now, and we're just listening to the drum and just the Bastel Pizza, no other modulation. We go into the configuration. What does this algo, what does that do? It allows us to choose one of 4 different algorithm types for that sequencer. Standard Euclidean, which is what we've been using up till now, and what you probably are used to when you think of Euclidean sequencing, which distributes the beats evenly across all of the different triggers. There's exponential, which tends to cluster the beats up at the trigger, shall I say, up at the start of the sequence. Inverted exponential, which clusters them down the end. And symmetrical Euclidean, which clusters them at the beginning and the end of the sequence loop. That's in standard Euclidean mode. Let's now go in and change it to exponential Euclidean mode. And now you see the triggers have kind of shifted around a little bit. If we go and look at it now from the point of view of inverted exponential mode, they've kind of shifted again. It's a little hard to see with this one. Might go in and change it to be There's a few more triggers towards the start here than at the end. And if we go in again and change it to symmetrical mode, they're kind of spread out a bit differently again. So you can play around with this and use this as a way to kind of mix up your sequences a little bit. You're not tied to standard Euclidean sequencing, which could get a little boring after a while. Say we had sequencer 3 going into the hi-hat over here. And let's unmute sequencer 3. I'll go in and increase the number of triggers. Let's say I actually wanted to do something fun, which was have sequencer 4 modulate sequencer 3, so every so often I get hi-hat fills. Now we already know how to do this with our macro controls. Let's look at how to do it with CV. We're in sequencer 3. I want to configure the CV input and we'll clear off what was there previously, and I'm going to choose fill because I want this to be triggered occasionally, and we will have say CV input 4 trigger the fills. Now, if a high voltage comes in on CV input 4, my sequencer for the hi-hats over here will trigger fills. Now, of course, I could generate that over here anywhere, but let's use the output of sequencer number 4 over here. And so we'll set up a few just random, there we go, just one gate initially. We'll turn on sequencer 4. All we have to do is patch the output of sequencer 4 into the input of CV4. Now we'll get more fills. Now the problem here we have is sequencer 4 is running too fast. It's filling, but then it's like going back to nothing. Let's do two things to change that. We can adjust the clock division for a sequencer by going into config and changing clock divider. And I'll change sequencer 4's clock divider down to 4. That means it'll take 4 triggers to advance the sequencer. Let's try this. Now the next problem is it's flashing because the gate isn't long enough to actually be long enough to trigger and hold it high while this other sequencer is playing. So again, let's go into sequencer 4 and change the gate time. Now we can go and increase it much higher by rotating around like this, and say we get up to 70, maybe up to 100 milliseconds. Can I get it up? There we go, to 110 milliseconds. Now we have a much better behavior because now our gate is being held high for long enough to actually make a difference on the other sequencer. So this shows you how we can get fun, different kind of self-patching ideas going on. Well, I've covered an awful lot today in the video on this sequencer. There's a lot more ideas and patch examples I could come up with. You could use it, for example, as a clock divider by clocking it externally and having different CV inputs mapped to things. But I think you get the idea that this is not just your standard Euclidean sequencer, and with a little bit of clever patching using external sequencers like your mimetic digitalis or potentially envelope generators, you can create interesting grooves and rhythms and modulation. And these two external rings that allow you to mute or fill or modulate the parameters are very well implemented, and I have to say make it a fun playable module. Do let me know if you have any questions down below in the comments. I love hearing from people and try and answer everybody's questions. And thank you so much for watching.